everyone, my name is Krissy Ponden and I am the art department chair at the Unclo School in Fairfield, Connecticut. And today I'm going to be showing you how to embroider on wood, which is something that I just started with my students this year, and it was really successful and they enjoyed the combination of technology and the hands-on physicality of actually being able to embroider. So I'm going to take you through the process that I showed my students. Some of the tools and things that I've used were very specific to the types of things that we have available to our school. So depending on what you have access to, you might want to try this a different way. And I'll give you some examples of ways that you can kind of work around some not having some of the instruments that we used. But overall, I think this was a really fun project and I'm happy to be able to share it with you today. So embroidering on wood is something that I happened to do a Google search and I came up with some really interesting images here, and that kind of inspired this project. So I'm going to share some of those with you. So these images here are ones that I shared with my students to just kind of get their thoughts going and try to conceptualize what they might want to make. So I loved this one here because it gives you kind of the before and after, where they can look and see how the actual dots came together, how those little holes that they could use, and then how the embroidery could look on top of this. So this was one. This I just thought was beautiful. This one actually is kind of a good inspiration for those who want to do more of the drawing aspect and maybe less of the embroidering, because the tool that we use to create these actually is called a Glowforge laser cutter. So it does not only the cutting process of the wood, but also the embroidering as well. So some students did opt to do that. These I thought were really cool, very easy to kind of come up with the layout for the dots, but the patterns that were used, you can see there's all different ones here and different colors, and it makes for a really interesting combination of things. This, for somebody that might want to do something that's a little more detailed, if you have any students that love cross stitch, this is kind of be a cool way for them to transition off of a canvas onto a wooden board, and getting to play with colors and tones and things like that would be a really neat thing. I had some students that wanted to do their name, or they wanted to do something kind of simple, so this was a neat way for them to be able to experiment with that. Another smaller version of a cross stitch. And then this I just thought was gorgeous. I'd love to have something like this hanging on my wall. But similar, you know, come up with the pattern first and then figure out where your dots are going to go, and I'll show you how to do all of that. So what I used to create this project, we have access to Adobe Illustrator at my school, which is a wonderful professional software for doing vector drawings. If you do not have access to that, there's a lot of free versions. One of the ones that I do like is called Vector, and I'm going to show you how to use that as well. So Vector right here, it's a free program, vectr.com. Does most of the things that Illustrator does. If you're looking for nuanced things, this is not the program for you, but it will be able for students, especially who are learning how to do this, to be able to create the vector illustrations that you're going to need to be able to cut this out on the Glowforge. So I'm actually going to switch and show you the inspiration for the one that I'm going to walk you through today, which is my little sketch right here you see up on the screen. So I did this by hand on a piece of paper first, and this was for me to plan out what I want my image to look like. So I scanned this in, I pulled it up here. I'm actually going to switch over to Adobe Illustrator, and here, that's the final result, but here's what I'm starting with. So my image, whatever your students draw. Another thing I found was really helpful was for them to actually use colored pencils or markers to figure out where are they going to have the actual stitching going to be, because that's going to change depending on where your dots are placed, where those holes are. So starting with this image, there's a couple different things that you can do depending on your students' comfortability using the software and also what their end goal is. If they're looking for something that's highly elaborate, you might want to use an image trace, or they want to be very specific to what they've already created, or they can kind of freehand this and just use the pen tool to be able to make some vector lines. So the pen tool in Adobe Illustrator is a really great way for you to just start by tracing some things and really getting used to it. I'm going to switch colors here. You can see exactly what color I'm going to be adding. So that'll show up nice on the screen here. So let's say that I wanted to do this piece right here, just by clicking, dragging the pen tool, I'm starting to make lines. And one of the great things about this is I can have a very symmetrical design, because I can take this and copy and paste it. So if that's my first piece right there, I can take this whole thing, copy and paste it. Oops, not that. Take this whole piece in the pink there, copy and paste it. Now I have another one and I can swap this around and make it symmetrical to what I had on the top. So if you have somebody, a student that wants to be very precise, you can see already how this is adjusting what I started with just my hand drawing. This will make a much more symmetrical piece. If you have a student that loved what they did and they don't want to go through this process of creating every single piece, a really easy thing to do is use the function called image trace. So in this case here, I think I have this locked. So I'm going to unlock this layer. So here's my original drawing that I opened up. And I am going to go up to edit, no, I'm sorry, object, and then image trace right here. So make and expand, that's just going to turn it into pieces that you can then select whatever you'd like to do with. So make and expand. It's telling me this is a large image, which means we're going to have a lot of little dots that it's going to show here, which is fine for our use. So as that comes in, you'll see what we end up with. All right, so here's my image trace. You can see that any of the paper went away because now it is no longer a pixelated image, it is just a vector image, which means that there's all these little points that the computer knows where a curve is, and then I can edit this and do with it as I wish. So if I take and start selecting, you can see all these little points that are coming up on the screen, and I can select these big areas in the back. And all I'm doing is I'm getting rid of, and I can actually, if I select something that is white like this, I can say same fill color, oops. Select same fill color, and then everything that has white like that will go away. Oops, don't want to do that. All right, I'm going to select same fill color. All right, and then all of this is going to delete. And then what I'm left with are these lines here. So these lines are showing up in black. I am going to select the lines. Same thing that I just did. I'm going to say same fill color. So now everything's selected, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to swap this. So instead of being filled, I'm going to see where my lines actually are. So now you can see this image with just the lines. So if I turn this into a drawing that will then be able to be read by our laser cutter, what I'm going to have to do is figure out where those dots are going to be. In this case right now, because it was an outline that I outlined around, I'm going to have 2 layers of dots when I turn this into lines. That may be something that you want, it may not be. It kind of depends on what your eventual goal is with this project. So I'll show you this and what this will look like, and then I'll show you the version that I did when I used the pen tool to just trace around and make it as more precise than this one is here, because this one's based off of my initial drawing, whereas the vector using the pen tool can make it more symmetrical. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my circle tool here. I'm going to hold down shift as I do this because I want this to be both similar height and width. So it's a perfect circle, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see what I'm doing here. So here's my little dot that I just made. I'm going to swap this so that it just is filled. It does not have an outline anymore. And now I'm going to turn this into a brush. And the way that I'm going to do this, I want to make sure that I have a decent size. Depending on what kind of needle you're using, what kind of thread, you want to adjust this based on that. I've found that anything like 0.05 will make a nice smallish hole. You don't really want them too large unless you're planning to do this with yarn, in which case you're going to completely change how you approach this. But in this case, something about this size is going to be perfectly fine for what it is that we're doing with embroidery floss. So I have my circle right here. I'm going to select it. I'm going to go over to my brush palette, and I'm going to click down here where it says new brush, so that little plus on the bottom. And when I click this, I'm making a pattern brush because I want this to repeat many times over so that I'll be able to get those holes without having to do them individually one by one, because that would take way too much time. So I'm going to say, okay, and it's going to bring up this palette right here. And I can see what I might want to have happen. It's going to give you a preview down here, which is perfect because this way we can see exactly what's going to happen. Now, without any space between these dots are going to be way too close together, and you're not going to be able to, it's basically just going to cut out a line on the printer. So we want to change this so that the spacing is 100% between the dot that it's going to make, and then there's a space, and then the dot again. So you can see here how this is going to look. So depending, again, what are you trying to do? Do you want to have large spaces between where your different stitches are going to be? Do you want them to be more close together? In this case, for this example, I'm going to do this about 100% space in between, and I'm going to say, okay. So what it's done now is it's added this brush to the bottom here, and what I'm going to be able to do is then select what I've already created. I'm going to go back to my full thing. I'm going to be able to select what I've created here and turn this whole thing into dots without me having to do anything more than pressing right on top of my brush right here. So you can see when I click on this, the entire thing will turn into dots. Now, this does this as approximately as the computer does. There's a lot of things that you're going to have to go back and refine based on how this came together and whether there's anything in your initial drawing that is going to cause overlap or problems when it goes to be cut out. So after I've done this, This is still a line. So this is still an editable line. If I change that line, if I do anything with it, those dots are going to adjust themselves. At this point though, because I'm happy with how my drawing looks, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna change these into individual objects so that it's no longer a line where the dots will automatically go by themselves, but now I'll be able to move the dots around depending on what it is that I'm doing. So I'm going to go up to Object, and I'm going to say Expand Appearance. And what this has done now, it has turned each of these little dots into their own individual thing here. So I can see that like that. So in this case, where I zoomed in right here, I have some dots that are very close to each other. I'm probably not going to want them like that, because what might happen is as I go to actually sew with this, it might be a little bit awkward, and maybe sometimes you even see dots that have overlapped on each other. So in this case, I can choose which one I want to get rid of. So I can take this dot and just start doing like this. So for your students, you can kind of have them just zoom in, see if there's any problematic areas that they would want to fix beforehand. I see another area right here where these two are right on top of each other. We don't need both of those there. We can get rid of one of them. And then once you're finally happy with how this is going to look, this is just for the dots themselves. Okay, so the little holes that are going to be drilled. And depending on what it is that you're creating, you may want to have an outline that cuts out this whole thing, or you may want to leave it in kind of a square frame, depending on what your student desires. So here's an example that I did, and this is the version that I did where I went back in with the pen tool. I copied and pasted things, so this is much more symmetrical than the other drawing is. And then I also added this outline, so you can see this red outline around the whole thing, which I want to have cut out as well. So in addition to anything that is going to be cut out with the dots here, I'm also going to have that be the overall thing that's cut out. Now at this stage, you can add embroidery if you wanted to have a word, if you wanted to have some texture, if there was image. I had some students do some really cool things, adding some imagery into this and some texture like that. Now's the time to figure that out, because you want to put all of those things into the program when you start using either the Glowforge or whatever kind of laser printer, laser cutter that you have access to. So I'm going to switch here. And the other thing that's really important about this is most of these laser cutters, whether you're using a Glowforge or you're using even a Cricut cutter, if anybody has one of those, you can do really cool things on paper. And I believe even more of a thicker cardstock, you can be able to cut some things out of that. But those computer programs take SVG files. So that's how you're going to want to save this. So make sure that when you go up to File and you go to Save This, you're going to want to save this as .svg. So format SVG, save that there, and then you're good to go. So now I'm going to open up Glowforge so you can see what this is going to look like. And on my end here, I see, and we're offline right now, but when this is online, you'll be able to see actually a version of exactly what's going on in there. This is our little camera there that's going to show up in our web browser here. And here's my image that I selected already that you saw earlier. And what I've done is I've added the dots and the outline. So both of those two separate files. And what's going to happen here is I want to make sure that I have this set up exactly for what I'm using. So I have medium draft board set up, which is the type of material that is something that comes with the Glowforge. It's one of their professional materials or certified materials. You can use whatever you want. You can do this on a piece of wood that you already own. You just have to enter those dimensions in yourself. So here's my things that I'm going to use. And I will show you what happens when we actually cut this out.
So this is sped up here 20 times, and in actuality, this particular piece, which is about 8 inches big, took 6 minutes to create, maybe a little bit more. Depending on the complexity of what it is that you are doing, these will take longer or less time to complete. Generally, engravings is what takes the most time. Just cutting out these little dots really doesn't take that long. So if you have something that's got an image on it, for example, that could take quite a while. So here I'm taking this out after it has been completed, and you'll notice that on top of the board here, on top of this draft board, there is a piece of white paper that is kind of glued down there, and that's to protect the wood itself. So that's the back, and there you can see it right there. You can just punch them through, and then you're going to end up with your design. So here's what I started with, and I gave kids the option of if they wanted to paint or they wanted to do any additional elements at this point. And so just to show you what that could potentially look like on this side, I just used markers to add some color. And then you can engrave or embroider right on top of that if you would like to. So I have my thread, needle and thread, and I just have regular old embroidery floss. I have a few different colors that I can work with here, and In terms of stitching, you can kind of decide how you want to do this, whether you want to just go around the edges. You can just stitch from stitch to stitch like this, do kind of a running stitch. If you want to have them going across like this to make some additional colors and patterns, it's kind of up to you and what you would like to do. So I'm going to start from the back. I'm going to put my needle right through the hole. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to pull this so that I leave a little tail. And you can have kids tape this if that's easier for them, if you don't want them to pull it out, or you can just kind of hold it while you're working. It kind of depends what you're gonna do. So in this case here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go straight across, and I am going to put my needle through. And so now I have this little piece that's coming across. If you are interested in, and this is where the planning part really comes in handy, that if you're interested in doing something where, say, all of these stitches came into the exact same hole, it would be a really good idea at that point that you have your students plan that out in advance, because there's only so many times you can fit a needle and thread through one of these tiny holes before it starts getting a little bit difficult to do. So you can just kind of keep going like this, depending on what your pattern is going to be. Sometimes the kids, it's helpful for them to flip it over to see what's going on. Others kind of get the hang of this and they're able to just keep pulling it through. However works best for them, and they can decide whether they would like this to end up looking similar all around. Do they want to add some different things? How much would they like to cover? In some cases, I had some students that added quite a bit. You can see here that this stitching went all the way around, so they really kind of doubled up on that and put a lot of different pieces like that. Some other students went over and over. You can see this moth right here, so that this entire thing, here's where we started with this, the image here, and here's how he filled it up like this. And this whole, all this texture right here, that was from the engraving done with the Glowforge machine. Some other students wanted to just do lines. In this case here, you can see some of those and how this turned out, where they have some areas where they're thicker like this, and then others there's patterns, and then some where it's just that running stitch all the way around. So it's really up to you and your students and what they would like to do. And I'll show you the finished version of this in just a minute. So here's the finished piece, and I filled in a lot of the areas with different types of stitches. Some areas I purposefully left open so you can see the color behind it. I definitely played with color on top of other colors so you can see that, as well as texture and different types of things like that. You can have your students leave them this way to finish up, or you can have them put a piece of felt on the back to cover this. You could even punch a hole if you'd like it to be a wall hanging. So there's a lot of different types of things you can do with this. This is just one example of one way you can get started and play around with some of the different types of possibilities. This is really open to whatever you and your students can imagine, and you can produce lots of really cool projects this way and give them a lot of ownership over what it is they're doing and ability to kind of come up with their own designs.
Well, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you along and see if we can troubleshoot whatever types of applications you will be using to create this project. And I hope you'd maybe be willing to share some of the amazing things that your students do as well. I'd love to see them to give some inspiration to my own students. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.